Night has a way of softening the noise of the world. As the day fades, history feels different, quieter, heavier, closer. Tonight, you are not here to rush through facts or chase conclusions. You are here to slow down, to listen, and to step gently into a story that once shaped thousands of lives and then slipped quietly into silence. Long before written records, before modern borders, before memory hardened into certainty, there was a city that believed itself stable, ordered, and enduring. Its streets were not paved with stone. Its power was not written in books, and yet, for generations, it stood as one of the greatest urban centers of its time. This is not a story of sudden collapse. It is a story of balance, pressure, and choices made slowly over years. So settle in, let the outside world fade for a while, and allow history to unfold at its own pace. Welcome to History After Nightfall. At the eastern edge of the North American interior, where the wide floodplain of the Mississippi River bends and reshapes itself with the seasons, a city emerged that should not have existed in the way it did, and yet did, decisively and for generations. Long before European arrival, long before maps imposed familiar borders, this region supported the rise of a planned urban centre whose scale, coordination, and internal discipline rivaled anything north of Mesoamerica. That city was Cahokia. At its height, around the 12th century, Cahokia was home to tens of thousands of people. Estimates vary, and archaeologists remain cautious, but even conservative figures place it among the largest urban concentrations in the world at that time. What matters more than the number itself is what that number implies. Sustained food production, controlled movement, shared authority, and a system capable of maintaining order without writing, coined money, or stone architecture. Cahokia did not rise from emptiness. For centuries, the Mississippi floodplain had supported small farming communities, loosely connected and seasonally mobile. These villages depended on maize agriculture, supplemented by hunting, fishing, and gathered foods. Over time, agricultural yields increased, storage techniques improved, and populations slowly grew. Exchange networks expanded along river corridors, carrying tools, raw materials, and cultural practices across vast distances. By the early 11th century, these dispersed communities began to reorganize themselves around a single center. Archaeologists identify this transformation clearly in the material record. Settlement patterns shift abruptly. Construction activity intensifies. Domestic spaces cluster closer together. Monumental earthworks appear on a scale previously unknown in the region. This was not organic sprawl. It required coordination, planning, and sustained leadership. The center of this new urban world was defined by geometry and intention. Cahokia's core was organized around a massive rectangular plaza, carefully leveled and deliberately kept open. This space was not leftover land between buildings. It was the heart of the city, a place designed for assembly, ceremony, and public life. Surrounding the plaza rose more than 100 earthen mounds, each shaped, positioned, and maintained with purpose. Some were flat-topped platforms that supported elite residences or temples. Others served as burial mounds. Their placement followed clear spatial rules, aligned to cardinal directions and sightlines that structured movement and attention across the landscape. Dominating them all stood Monk's Mound, the largest earthen structure in the Pre-Columbian Americas. Rising in 4 terraces, it required millions of basket loads of soil, carried and packed by human hands. Its construction unfolded over decades, perhaps longer, demanding repeated mobilization of labor across generations. This fact alone reveals something essential. Cahokia's leaders possessed the authority to organize work at a scale that went far beyond household or village obligation. People returned season after season to build and maintain structures that offered no immediate personal reward. Such cooperation does not occur by chance. It is cultivated through social systems that reward compliance and normalize participation. Agriculture made this possible. The fertile soils of the floodplain supported intensive maize cultivation, producing surpluses well beyond daily needs. These surpluses fed not only farmers, but also builders, craftspeople, administrators, and ritual specialists. Food security underpinned urban life, yet surplus alone does not create stability. Organization does. Evidence suggests that food storage and redistribution were managed centrally. Although storage facilities leave subtle traces, patterns of consumption imply planned accumulation and controlled access. In times of abundance, this system reinforced loyalty. In times of shortfall, it increased dependence on central authority. Power at Cahokia was therefore both economic and symbolic. The elite lived elevated above the population, physically and socially. Platform mounds lifted their residences and ceremonial buildings above the surrounding terrain. This elevation was not defensive. It was communicative. Every upward glance reminded inhabitants where authority resided. Movement through the city reinforced this message. Pathways directed people toward the central plaza. Processional routes structured communal gatherings. Daily routines unfolded within an environment designed to teach order without written instruction. Ritual was the system's binding force. Cahokian ceremonies followed a predictable calendar tied to celestial observation. The construction of timber circles, known collectively as woodhenge, demonstrates precise astronomical knowledge. These structures marked solstices and equinoxes, aligning the movement of the sun with ritual time. This alignment served practical purposes, guiding agricultural cycles and labor schedules. But it also shaped belief. Those who controlled ritual knowledge controlled the calendar. Those who controlled the calendar shaped expectations about when to plant, when to gather, and when authority should be renewed. For ordinary inhabitants, participation in these ceremonies reinforced belonging. For newcomers, and there were many, ritual provided a shared framework that transcended local origin. Cahokia was a magnet, drawing people from across the Midwest. What unified them was not ancestry, but participation in a system that promised order and continuity. That system depended on predictability. The city's layout remained remarkably consistent for generations. Unlike many urban centers, Cahokia did not continually reinvent its core. The plaza stayed central. Monk's Mound remained dominant. Authority did not decentralize. This stability carried clear advantages. Social roles were well defined. Seasonal expectations were reinforced year after year. In a landscape shaped by environmental variability, such predictability would have felt reassuring, even necessary. Archaeological evidence from this period supports this impression. Burial remains suggest generally adequate nutrition. Craft production flourished, producing shell ornaments, finely worked stone tools, and ceremonial objects. Long-distance trade networks brought copper, mica, and marine shell into the city, linking Cahokia to regions hundreds of kilometers away. Notably, there is little evidence of sustained internal conflict during this phase. This does not imply perfect harmony, but it suggests that governance mechanisms were effective. Authority was accepted, or at least not openly resisted. What is often overlooked is the psychological effect of such long-term order. When a system delivers reliably across generations, it reshapes expectation itself. Children grow into adulthood knowing only one social arrangement. Authority becomes habitual rather than contested. The absence of disruption is interpreted not as success, but as normality. From a historical perspective, Cahokia represents a form of urbanism that relied less on constant coercion and more on integration of economy, ritual, and space. Its success lay in how thoroughly these elements reinforced one another. For nearly 2 centuries, the system worked. Standing at the edge of the central plaza during a major gathering, you would have witnessed not disorder, but coordination. Thousands of people moving according to shared rhythms, attention directed upward toward elevated figures framed by monumental earthworks. The city itself instructed its inhabitants where to stand, when to gather, and whom to follow. This is why Cahokia appeared so stable. Its order was not improvised. It was engineered, maintained, and normalized across generations. Yet embedded within that success was an assumption that the conditions enabling such order would continue unchanged. At this stage in Cahokia's history, there is no clear sign of strain. The fields produce, the rituals align, the authority holds. And precisely because the system holds so well, it leaves little room for alternatives. Cahokia's rise into a true urban centre depended not only on belief, ritual, or authority, but on systems that functioned physically, repeatedly, and at scale. A settlement of this size could not survive on flexibility alone. It required engineering, not expressed in stone walls or metal tools, but in the disciplined organization of land, water, labor, and food across an entire landscape. The city stood within the American Bottom, a broad alluvial plain formed by the slow movement of the Mississippi River and its tributaries. This environment offered extraordinary fertility. Seasonal flooding renewed the soil with nutrients, allowing high agricultural yields year after year. For small villages, this meant abundance with manageable risk. For a dense urban population, it meant opportunity tightly bound to constraint. Flooding imposed discipline. Planting windows were narrow. Harvests had to be completed before excessive moisture ruined crops. Storage had to anticipate not only consumption, but failure. In earlier village systems, a poor harvest could be offset by relocation, diversification, or exchange. In Cahokia, population concentration removed those options. Food production became a logistical problem rather than a household one. By the 12th century, Cahokia supported a population numbering in the tens of thousands. Such density was unprecedented in the region. Feeding this population required large-scale coordination across the surrounding countryside. Maize became the dominant crop because it produced high caloric returns and could be dried for storage. Over time, the landscape around the city was reorganized into an agricultural engine designed to sustain the urban core. Fields expanded outward in carefully managed zones. They had to remain close enough to allow efficient transport of harvests, yet distant enough to avoid repeated flood damage and soil exhaustion. Maintaining this balance required both inherited knowledge and central oversight. Timing became critical. Labor had to be mobilized simultaneously across wide areas to plant and harvest within narrow seasonal windows. This dependence on maize increased efficiency, but it also narrowed resilience. Bioarchaeological studies show that as maize consumption intensified, dietary diversity declined. Skeletal remains from later occupational phases reveal increased signs of nutritional stress, including enamel hypoplasia and iron deficiency. These indicators do not point to famine. Instead, they suggest a population operating closer to its biological limits, even during periods of apparent stability. Engineering extended beyond agriculture into the city itself. Cahokia's monumental core was a constructed environment. The central plaza was not naturally flat. It was deliberately leveled through sustained labor, involving the movement of enormous volumes of soil. This surface had to be maintained continually. Rain, flooding, and constant foot traffic eroded it year after year. Drainage systems were essential. Channels and ditches diverted water away from ceremonial and administrative spaces, preventing seasonal flooding from rendering the plaza unusable. These systems worked, but only through constant upkeep. Silt accumulated, slopes collapsed. Repairs became routine rather than exceptional. Earthworks demanded similar attention. Mounds settled over time, their surfaces eroded. Each repair required labor, and labor required food. Infrastructure and subsistence became locked in a reinforcing cycle. The more complex the city became, the more energy was required simply to preserve it. As Cahokia expanded, residential areas spread beyond the original monumental core. These districts were denser and more utilitarian. Houses were rebuilt frequently, often on the same footprints, suggesting limited space for expansion. Refuse accumulated more rapidly. Access to clean water varied between neighborhoods. These conditions were not catastrophic, but they marked a shift from abundance to management. Fuel placed additional pressure on the system. A city of Cahokia's size required immense quantities of wood for cooking, heating, construction, and ritual fires. Surrounding forests were gradually depleted. Pollen records show a decline in arboreal species near the site, consistent with sustained deforestation. As nearby sources diminished, wood had to be gathered from increasingly distant locations. Deforestation produced cascading environmental effects. Reduced tree cover increased soil erosion. Runoff intensified during storms. Sediment loads in waterways rose, affecting both agricultural fields and drainage channels. Flood behavior became harder to predict, not because the river itself changed suddenly, but because the landscape around it had been reshaped by human activity. Cahokia's leadership responded not by decentralizing, but by intensifying organization. Labor schedules became more rigid. Agricultural work, construction, and ritual obligations were synchronized with greater precision. Large communal projects served practical purposes, while also reinforcing participation in the system. From the outside, this appears as resilience. From within, it narrowed flexibility. High population density reduced options. Storage facilities could buffer short-term shortages, but they could not absorb repeated stress indefinitely. Transporting maize from distant fields into the city required precise timing. Spoilage, delay, or disruption had immediate consequences. There was little slack in the system. Archaeological layers from this period show repeated rebuilding rather than innovation. Structures were repaired where they stood. Fields were reused even as yields fluctuated. Innovation slowed, not because knowledge was lacking, but because deviation carried risk. When systems become tightly coupled, experimentation threatens stability. Population pressure reshaped social relations as well. As more people depended on centrally managed resources, authority became less negotiable. Access to food, land, and protection flowed through established channels. Compliance was no longer simply cultural or ritual, it was structural. For most inhabitants, daily life may still have felt orderly. Food arrived, ceremonies continued, the city functioned. But maintaining that order required increasing effort. Each year demanded more labor, closer coordination, and greater trust in leadership. This is how systemic pressure accumulates, not through sudden disaster, but through the gradual erosion of margins. The same outcomes require more energy. The system becomes efficient, but brittle. By the late 12th century, Cahokia had engineered itself into a condition where success depended on near-perfect alignment between environment, labor, and authority. The city still endured. Its infrastructure still functioned. Its population remained large. But endurance now came at a cost. Cahokia had become a place where maintaining stability required constant work, where error margins were thin, and where any sustained disruption, environmental, logistical, or social, would reverberate through every layer of urban life. The system had not yet failed, but the pressure shaping its future was already firmly in place. For a long time, Cahokia's systems absorbed strain without visible disruption. Engineering compensated for pressure, organization compensated for density, ritual compensated for uncertainty. But no system, however disciplined, operates outside the physical limits of climate and environment. When those limits began to shift, the first signs were not dramatic. They were incremental, uneven, and easy to explain away. Modern archaeology allows us to reconstruct these changes with increasing precision. Soil samples, pollen records, tree ring data, and sediment layers all point to environmental variability intensifying during the late 12th and early 13th centuries. Cahokia did not face a single catastrophic event. Instead, it encountered a sequence of stresses that challenged assumptions the city had long relied upon. One of the most significant factors was climate instability, associated with what climatologists identify as the transition into the Little Ice Age. This was not a sudden plunge into cold conditions, nor was it uniform across regions. In the Mississippi Valley, it manifested primarily as increased variability, cooler average temperatures, more frequent extreme weather, and disrupted seasonal patterns. For an agricultural system dependent on precise timing, this mattered enormously. Maize agriculture requires predictable warmth during its growing season. Even small shifts in temperature or rainfall can reduce yields. Archaeological evidence suggests that harvest reliability declined during this period. Fields that had once produced consistent surpluses became less dependable. Storage could absorb a single poor year. Repeated shortfalls, however, placed cumulative strain on the system. Flooding patterns also changed. The Mississippi River did not simply flood more often, it flooded differently. Sediment layers indicate episodes of more intense flooding, interspersed with periods of lower water levels. For farmers, this meant uncertainty. Fields could be inundated unexpectedly or left dry when moisture was needed most. Cahokia's engineered landscape amplified these effects. Deforestation and soil compaction altered runoff behavior. Without tree cover to stabilize banks and absorb rainfall, floodwaters moved faster and carried more sediment. Drainage systems designed for earlier conditions struggled to adapt. The response was not retreat, it was intensification. As yields fluctuated, pressure increased to maximize output from existing fields. Archaeological evidence suggests shorter fallow periods and more continuous cultivation. These practices can maintain production temporarily, but they degrade soil structure over time. What appears as stability in one season quietly undermines future resilience. Dietary stress becomes visible in the human record. Skeletal remains from this period show increasing markers of physiological strain. Enamel hyperplasia, indicating childhood stress, becomes more common. Signs of anemia increase. These patterns do not reflect starvation. They reflect populations living closer to nutritional thresholds, with less margin for error. At the same time, ritual activity intensified. Excavations reveal increased investment in ceremonial construction during this period. Mounds were rebuilt, plaza surfaces were renewed, woodhenge structures were replaced and realigned. These efforts required labor at moments when agricultural demands were already rising. From a social perspective, this makes sense. When uncertainty grows, societies often turn toward ritual reinforcement rather than structural change. Ritual does not solve environmental problems, but it can stabilize belief, reinforce authority, and maintain cohesion, at least temporarily. Yet ritual can also become rigid. Evidence suggests that ceremonial calendars became more demanding rather than more flexible. Rather than adapting to disrupted seasons, rituals appear to have doubled down on established cycles. This rigidity placed additional strain on labor scheduling. People were required to meet ceremonial obligations even as subsistence demands intensified. Flood events left physical traces within the city itself. Sediment deposits in low-lying areas indicate episodes of water intrusion into residential zones. While not catastrophic, these events would have displaced households temporarily and damaged stored food. Each incident eroded confidence in systems that had once felt reliable. Importantly, these stresses were unevenly distributed. Elite residences, elevated on mounds, were less vulnerable to flooding. Access to stored food was likely prioritized. Peripheral neighborhoods, by contrast, bore the brunt of disruption. This disparity mattered. When hardship is shared, cohesion can survive. When hardship is uneven, trust erodes. Archaeologists also observe changes in material culture during this period. Craft production becomes more standardized, less diverse. This suggests reduced experimentation and tighter control over resources. Trade networks appear to contract. Fewer exotic materials reach the city. indicating either reduced exchange capacity or declining influence. None of these signs alone indicate failure. Together, they form a pattern. Cahokia was still functioning. Fields were still planted. Ceremonies still occurred. The city had not emptied. But the margin that once absorbed disruption was thinning. Systems that had been designed for abundance were now managing scarcity, even if that scarcity was relative rather than absolute. From the perspective of the inhabitants, the experience would not have been framed as crisis. It would have been framed as effort. More work required to achieve the same results. More ritual required to maintain order. More obedience required to keep systems functioning. This is the most dangerous phase in the life of complex societies. Not collapse, but persistence under strain. Because persistence masks vulnerability. Cahokia's leaders likely interpreted these challenges through existing frameworks. Poor harvests could be explained ritually. Floods could be framed cosmologically. Intensifying ceremony reinforced the belief that order could be restored through correct observance. But environmental systems did not respond to belief. By the early 13th century, the alignment between climate, agriculture, and infrastructure had shifted enough that recovery required adaptation rather than reinforcement. Yet adaptation threatens established authority. Changing calendars, redistributing land, or decentralizing control would have undermined the very order that defined Cahokia's power. So the system held, and in holding, it hardened. The signs of failure were real, measurable, and cumulative. They were written into bones, soils, and sediments. They were not dramatic enough to force immediate change, but they were persistent enough to reshape the future. Cahokia had entered a phase where survival depended not on expansion or confidence, but on endurance under conditions that no longer favored the system it had built. The city did not fall at this moment, but the ground beneath it had already begun to shift. The pressures accumulating around Cahokia did not express themselves immediately through open revolt or organized warfare. Archaeology offers no evidence of citywide destruction, no burned layers signaling invasion, no fortifications hastily raised in response to an external enemy. What emerges instead is a subtler, more corrosive process, internal fracture unfolding without spectacle. Cahokia's social order was hierarchical from its foundation. Authority was spatially encoded, ritualized, and reinforced through control of labor and resources. During periods of abundance, this hierarchy could function with minimal friction. When surplus narrowed and environmental uncertainty increased, hierarchy became more visible and more consequential. Elite power was concentrated physically and symbolically. Platform mounds elevated residences and ceremonial buildings above the surrounding city. The separation was not merely architectural. It shaped access to food, safety, and ritual privilege. As flooding and subsistence stress affected lower-lying neighborhoods more frequently, inequality was no longer abstract. It was experienced. One of the clearest archaeological indicators of this imbalance appears in mortuary practices. Earlier in Cahokia's history, burials suggest relatively consistent treatment across social groups. Over time, this changes. Certain individuals were interred with extraordinary care, accompanied by prestige goods and elaborate arrangements. Others were buried hastily, in groups, without markers of status. The most striking example comes from Mound 72, where excavations revealed evidence of large-scale human sacrifice. Dozens of young individuals, many of them women, were buried simultaneously, arranged in deliberate patterns. These were not casualties of battle. They show no signs of combat trauma. Their deaths were ritualized. Archaeologists are careful in interpreting this evidence. The presence of sacrifice does not, by itself, indicate social collapse. Many societies have practiced ritual killing within stable systems. What matters is timing and context. At Cahokia, the intensification of such practices coincides with periods of environmental stress and declining subsistence margins. Ritual killing can serve multiple functions. It may reinforce elite authority, dramatize cosmological order, or attempt to restore balance during crisis. But it also carries a cost. It transforms belief into coercion. Participation becomes obligation, not consent. For the wider population, this shift would have been felt quietly. Trust erodes not through a single act, but through repetition. When ritual demands increase while material security declines, confidence in leadership weakens. People continue to comply, but belief becomes thinner. There is no evidence that Cahokia descended into open civil conflict. Instead, what appears is withdrawal. Households begin to disengage. Construction slows in peripheral areas. Maintenance of smaller mounds declines. These are not signs of rebellion, but of exhaustion. Political power at Cahokia was inseparable from spiritual authority. Leaders did not simply govern, they mediated between human and cosmic orders. When floods continued despite ritual observance, when harvests fluctuated despite sacrifice, the credibility of that mediation weakened. Importantly, this did not lead to immediate rejection of the system. Most societies do not abandon their foundational structures at the first sign of failure. Instead, they persist, often doubling down on familiar practices. Cahokia's elite appear to have done precisely that. Ritual intensified, control tightened, deviation became riskier. Material culture reflects this narrowing. Craft traditions become more standardized. Artistic variation declines. This suggests reduced tolerance for experimentation and greater emphasis on conformity. Trade networks also contract. Fewer exotic materials enter the city, indicating either declining external influence or reduced capacity to sustain long-distance relationships. Social stress is also visible in skeletal evidence. Trauma markers increase slightly, not in patterns consistent with warfare, but with interpersonal violence. These injuries are unevenly distributed, suggesting localized conflict rather than organized rebellion. Tension existed, but it did not coalesce into revolution. One of the most telling signs of rupture is demographic. Population decline begins not at the center, but at the margins. Peripheral settlements thin out. Smaller communities detach first. This suggests that people responded to pressure not by confronting authority, but by leaving it behind. This process is politically devastating for a centralized system. Authority that depends on participation cannot function if people simply disengage. Labor becomes harder to mobilize. Ritual loses its audience. The system still exists, but it no longer commands the same gravity. For those who remained in the urban core, life became more constrained. With fewer participants, the burden of maintaining infrastructure fell on a shrinking base. Ritual obligations did not decrease proportionally. If anything, they intensified as leaders attempted to reaffirm order. This creates a feedback loop. Increased demands accelerate exhaustion. Exhaustion accelerates withdrawal. Withdrawal undermines authority. Authority responds with further intensification. None of this produces dramatic collapse. There are no final battles, no singular moments of decision. The rupture is silent because it unfolds through individual choices made over years. To move away, to stop rebuilding, to no longer participate fully. From the perspective of the elite, this would have appeared as incomprehensible failure. The rituals were correct, the calendars were observed, the hierarchy remained intact, and yet the city was slowly emptying. Cahokia's internal conflict was not a war of factions, but a fracture between expectation and experience. The system demanded faith at precisely the moment when evidence undermined it. That contradiction could not be resolved through force alone. By the early 13th century, Cahokia still stood. Its mounds remained. Its plazas were intact. But the social fabric that had animated them was thinning. Authority persisted, but allegiance waned. The rupture had already occurred. It simply had not announced itself. Cahokia did not end with a single decision, a final ceremony, or a sudden moment of departure. Archaeology offers no evidence for an overnight evacuation, no trace of mass panic or coordinated flight. Instead, what emerges from the ground is something slower, quieter, and far more difficult to recognize in real time. A phased withdrawal shaped by human calculation, fatigue, and changing expectations. The process began at the margins. During the early 13th century, settlements surrounding Cahokia began to thin out. These satellite communities were not peripheral in function. They were essential. They supplied food, labor, and ritual participants to the urban core. Their integration into Cahokia's system had once been an advantage. Under pressure, it became a liability. Flooding events, declining agricultural reliability, and increasing labor demands affected these outlying settlements first. Their fields were often more exposed. Their access to stored food was less secure. When conditions worsened, families faced a choice that Cahokia's core residents could delay, endure, or relocate. Relocation was not an unfamiliar response in the Mississippi Valley. For centuries, communities had shifted settlement locations as soils depleted or environments changed. What made this moment different was not the act of leaving, but what was being left behind. Cahokia was not simply a village. It was a center of power, ritual, and identity. Choosing to leave meant disengaging from that center. Archaeological surveys showed that these satellite settlements did not disappear simultaneously. Some were abandoned quickly, others declined gradually. Houses were left unrepaired. Storage pits fell out of use. Occupation layers thin, then stop. This staggered pattern suggests individual household decisions rather than a central directive. As these communities emptied, the consequences reached inward. With fewer people contributing labor and food, Cahokia's systems became harder to sustain. Fields located farther from the urban core were abandoned first, increasing reliance on land closer to the city. land already under stress from continuous use. Transport distances shortened, but productivity declined. Within Cahokia itself, residential neighborhoods began to change in subtle ways. Houses were rebuilt less frequently. Some plots were left vacant. Archaeological mapping reveals increasing gaps between occupied structures. These absences are among the most telling signs of decline. Cities depend on density. When density erodes, urban life changes fundamentally. Population decline was not uniform. Areas closer to ceremonial and elite spaces remained occupied longer. This suggests continued access to resources or stronger attachment to the system. But even these zones eventually thinned. The city was not contracting inward neatly. It was dissolving unevenly. For those who remained, daily life became more demanding. With fewer inhabitants, the burden of maintaining infrastructure fell on a shrinking base. Drainage channels clogged more often. Plaza surfaces eroded without regular resurfacing. Mounds weathered without repair. Tasks that had once been shared by many now fell to fewer hands. Ritual obligations did not necessarily decrease in proportion to population loss. In some cases, they intensified. Leaders attempting to preserve authority and coherence may have relied even more heavily on ceremony. But ceremonies require participants. As crowds thinned, their effect changed. What had once felt collective began to feel strained. Psychologically, this period would have been deeply unsettling. Urban life depends on expectation. People expect crowds in plazas, activity in neighborhoods, continuity in routine. When familiar faces vanish, when movement slows, when ceremonies feel diminished, confidence erodes. The city no longer feels inevitable. Leaving Cahokia was not a simple act of migration. The city was embedded in belief. Its mounds anchored cosmology. Ancestors were buried within its earthworks. Authority was mapped onto its landscape. To depart was to step away from a worldview, not just a location. Yet people did leave. Archaeological evidence shows new settlements forming along river valleys to the north, east, and south. These communities retained elements of Mississippian culture, maize agriculture, pottery styles, social practices. What they did not replicate was Cahokia's extreme centralization. This distinction matters. The dispersal of Cahokia's population does not signal cultural failure. It signals adaptation. People did not abandon farming, ritual life, or social organization. They abandoned scale. Smaller communities offered flexibility. Fields could be shifted. Labor demands were lower. Authority was more negotiable. In these new settings, the lessons of Cahokia may have informed different choices. How rigid calendars should be. How concentrated power could safely become. How much dependency a system could tolerate. For those who remained in Cahokia's core, conditions grew harsher. As population declined, inequality likely sharpened. Elite households, elevated and better positioned, retained advantages. Peripheral residents faced greater insecurity. Skeletal evidence from later occupational phases suggests heightened physiological stress among remaining populations. At some point, Cahokia crossed a threshold. Not a threshold of survival, but of function. The city could no longer operate as an urban centre in the way it once had. Its plazas no longer gathered tens of thousands. Large-scale labour projects could not be sustained. Authority, dependent on participation, lost its reach. Yet even then, Cahokia was not immediately abandoned. Small groups continued to live among the mounds. Fires burned in former residential areas. The landscape retained meaning. Sacred places rarely lose significance all at once. But the city as a system, integrated, commanding, central, was gone. What remains archaeologically is not a clean ending, but a palimpsest. Layers of use and non-use. Structures repaired, then ignored. Spaces repurposed, then avoided. The process unfolded over decades, perhaps generations. This challenges modern expectations. We often imagine societal endings as dramatic. Cahokia reminds us that decline is often quiet. People leave when staying no longer makes sense, not when catastrophe forces them out. The human cost of this process should not be underestimated. Leaving ancestral places involves loss of familiarity, of status, of certainty. Those who moved carried memories of a city that had once promised permanence. Those who stayed watched that promise dissolve. By the mid-13th century, Cahokia existed as a place, not as a power. Its mounds still shaped the horizon. Its plazas still marked the ground. But the dense web of relationships that had sustained it was gone. The abandonment of Cahokia was not a failure of intelligence or effort. It was the outcome of choices made under pressure, constrained by systems that no longer matched their environment. People adapted the only way they could. They left. Cahokia is often described as a mystery, but that word can obscure more than it reveals. From the perspective of modern archaeology, the disappearance of the city is not a single unanswered question, but a series of well-documented processes, interrupted by genuine limits in evidence. What science allows us to say with confidence is substantial. What remains unresolved is equally important, not because it invites fantasy, but because it defines the boundary between knowledge and assumption. Modern understanding of Cahokia rests on decades of interdisciplinary research. Excavation, bioarchaeology, paleoclimatology, geophysical survey, and landscape analysis have all contributed to a clearer picture of how the city functioned and why it was ultimately abandoned. No single factor explains its decline. Instead, the evidence points to convergence. At the center of that convergence is environment. Climatic reconstruction based on tree ring data, sediment cores, and regional paleoecological studies confirms increased variability during the 13th century. In the Mississippi Valley, this did not manifest as constant drought or unbroken cold, but as instability. Growing seasons shortened, weather extremes became more frequent, flood behavior became less predictable. For small communities, such variability could be absorbed. For Cahokia, it could not. The city's agricultural system had been optimized for productivity, not flexibility. Maize yields were high, but the system depended on narrow seasonal windows and coordinated labor across wide areas. When climate variability disrupted these rhythms, the system had no surplus of adaptability to compensate. Environmental pressure alone, however, does not empty a city. Equally important is what archaeology reveals about human response. Excavated neighborhoods show patterns of gradual disengagement rather than panic. Houses were not destroyed. Tools were not abandoned in place. Instead, structures were dismantled or left to decay. Valuable items were removed. This indicates planned departure. Bioarchaeological evidence reinforces this interpretation. Skeletal remains from Cahokia's later phases do not show widespread trauma associated with violence or mass starvation. Instead, they reveal chronic stress, nutritional deficiency, repetitive strain, and disease, consistent with dense populations living under pressure. In other words, people were not forced out. They chose to leave. One of the most powerful tools reshaping Cahokia research in recent decades has been remote sensing. LiDAR surveys have revealed previously unknown features beneath modern development and vegetation. These surveys confirm that Cahokia was even larger and more complex than earlier estimates suggested, with extensive suburban zones, agricultural modifications, and water management features extending far beyond the monumental core. At the same time, LiDAR shows contraction. Later occupation layers shrink inward, peripheral zones lose density. The city does not collapse symmetrically, it unravels. This spatial evidence aligns closely with settlement data from the wider region. As Cahokia declined, new Mississippian centers emerged elsewhere. Smaller, less centralized, and more geographically dispersed. This pattern strongly suggests redistribution rather than disappearance. People did not vanish. They reorganized. This is where popular narratives often mislead. There is no evidence for epidemic wiping out the population. No archaeological signature supports sudden mass mortality. European diseases cannot be invoked. Contact occurred centuries later. Similarly, invasion theories lack support. There are no burn layers, no defensive works hastily constructed, no weapon trauma consistent with conquest. The decline of Cahokia does not resemble defeat. It resembles decision-making under constraint. Modern archaeology also forces us to confront the limits of centralized systems. Cahokia functioned exceptionally well when environmental conditions aligned with its design. When those conditions shifted, the same features that once ensured success became liabilities. High population density, rigid ritual calendars, and labor-intensive infrastructure reduced flexibility. This insight has broader implications. Cahokia challenges the assumption that societal complexity always increases resilience. In reality, complexity often trades adaptability for efficiency. Systems become highly productive, but sensitive to disruption. When disruption persists, simplification can be a rational response. From this perspective, Cahokia's abandonment is not a failure. It is an adaptive reconfiguration. The most unresolved questions concern leadership and perception. Archaeology can show when people left and where they went. It cannot fully reveal how decisions were debated, justified, or resisted. We do not know whether Cahokia's elite recognized the limits of their system or believed that continued ritual reinforcement would restore order. What we can say is that authority did not prevent departure. This is crucial. Cahokia was not held together by force alone. When participation waned, leaders lacked mechanisms to compel a population to remain. Power dissolved not through overthrow, but through irrelevance. Another unresolved area involves identity. To what extent did Cahokia's inhabitants continue to see themselves as part of a shared polity after dispersal? Material culture suggests continuity, but also divergence. Pottery styles evolve, settlement layouts vary, ritual practices adapt to local conditions. This suggests that Cahokia did not fragment into copies of itself. Its legacy was selective. Modern descendant communities are also part of this story. Indigenous nations across the Midwest trace cultural and spiritual connections to Mississippian societies. For them, Cahokia is not an abstract case study. It is part of a living heritage, disrupted by later colonial violence and displacement. Contemporary archaeology increasingly recognizes this. Research now involves consultation, collaboration, and ethical reflection. Cahokia is not merely an object of study, it is a place of meaning. So what, finally, remains unresolved? We cannot know the precise sequence of decisions that led families to leave at particular moments. We cannot reconstruct conversations, debates, or internal dissent. We cannot determine how hope, fear, loyalty, and fatigue interacted within individual lives. But we do not need those details to understand the outcome. Cahokia shows us that societies do not need to be destroyed to end. They can dissolve through accumulated pressure, rational choice, and shifting priorities. Complexity does not guarantee permanence. Scale does not ensure stability. The real significance of Cahokia lies here. It was not an anomaly that failed inexplicably. It was a sophisticated system that reached the limits of its design. When those limits became clear, people adapted in the only way that preserved long-term survival. They left the city behind. What remained was earth, mounds shaped by human hands, plazas once filled with movement, landscapes bearing the imprint of organization on a monumental scale. These traces endure not as symbols of mystery, but as evidence of what humans can build, and of when and why they choose to walk away. As the night deepens, the echoes of this story remain, not as answers, but as questions. Where are you listening from tonight? What part of the world are you in as this story reaches you? If this journey through history stayed with you, even for a moment, feel free to share where you are watching from in the comments below. And if you find something meaningful here, consider leaving a like. It helps this quiet corner of history reach others who may be listening in the dark. For more stories told slowly, thoughtfully, and without hurry, you are welcome to subscribe. Until the next night, and the next forgotten chapter of history.